Practical Anarchy, A Guide to Self-Determination, Dicky. Part 9. Enlightenment, Dissent, A Reason Without Rulers. By the late 18th century, the word anarchy was still mainly an insult, but some philosophers started whispering other possibilities. William Godwin, often called the first modern anarchist, published an inquiry concerning political justice in 1793. His argument was simple but devastating. Governments corrupt morals, power distorts judgment, and ordinary people are capable of organising themselves rationally. He didn't call himself an anarchist, but the blueprint was there, a society of cooperation without government. The French Revolution was a spark that lit up Europe, and at the same time a warning flare. On one side it showed the power of the ordinary people. The fall of Bastille in 1789 was less about royal prisoners and more about a symbol. The crowd could topple what seemed immovable. In the sections of Paris, neighbourhood assemblies debated and decided, a living experiment in direct democracy. Sans-culottes marched, organised bread riots, and made it clear that politics wasn't just for powered Whigs. On the other side, anarchy became a word of fear. Moderates in the National Assembly, their allies abroad, used it constantly to describe the storming of the Tuileries, the September massacres, the sans-culottes on the march. Anarchy was chaos, blood, mob, rule. The association stuck in political vocabulary. Radical voices inside the revolution pushed further. Jacques Roux and the Anarchists argued not just for liberty, but for economic equality, bread, fair prices, no exploitation. Roux thundered that freedom without bread was a joke. The Jacobins silenced him, but his demands pointed towards what anarchists later called social revolution. The revolution also showed the trap of centralisation. The monarchy fell, but a committee of public safety rose. Power concentrated in the hands of Robespierre and the Jacobins, and soon the guillotine was mowing down not just aristocrats but fellow revolutionaries. The lesson many later anarchists took was clear. Changing rulers is not enough. Hierarchy regenerates itself, even in the name of liberty. For William Godwin, watching from England, the revolution confirmed his suspicion that political authority corrupts, however noble its beginnings. For Proudhon, half a century later, it was proof that political revolution without societal transformation was doomed to betray its promises. The French Revolution was both light and shadow, inspiration for mass action, but also a reminder that state power, even in revolutionary hands, can become just another form of domination. Mary Wollstonecraft, Godwin's partner, was equally radical. In A Vindication of Rights of Women, she argued that domination is domination, whether of a man over a woman or rulers over subjects. Though not labelled anarchist, her ideas about equality and the corruption of power resonated deeply with later anarchist feminists. Elsewhere, Thomas Paine flirted with similar notions in Rights of Man. He still imagined government, but stripped down, minimal, temporary, and always under suspicion. The French Revolution, meanwhile, proved the danger of replacing one tyranny with another. Kings fell, but guillotines kept working. Many radicals concluded that authority itself was the problem. These Enlightenment voices didn't yet wave black flags, but they opened the door. Reason can organise itself, and power, far from protecting us, corrodes freedom. Section 10. 19th Century Anarchism, from Whispers to Roars. By the 1800s, anarchism had its first loud voices. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, in 1840, declared property is theft. He also claimed anarchy is order, flipping the insult into a badge of pride. For him, mutualism was the way forward, small producers and cooperatives trading without bosses or states. He argued for credit systems and workers' associations, laying the groundwork for future experiments. If feudalism chained people to the land, the Industrial Revolution strapped them to machines. From the late 18th century through the 19th, factories sprouted up across Europe and America. Steam, coal, steel transformed landscapes, But for workers, the change often meant 12-hour days, child labour, cramped slums and the dull rhythm of the clock. The old ties of village and commons were ripped up, replaced by wage slavery in mills and mines. It was here that anarchism sharpened its teeth. Proudhon saw how industrial capitalism created both wealth and misery. His answer? Mutualism, called for workers' associations or cooperatives and free credit, so labour could free itself from both boss and banker. For him, industry could serve freedom if torn from capitalist hands. Bakunin took a harder line. He saw the new working class as a revolutionary subject, the mass that could topple both state and capital. To him, industrial discipline didn't just exploit bodies, it trained obedience, making rebellion not just desirable but necessary. Kropotkin, scientist as he was, studied industry closely. In fields, factories and workshops, he argued that machines and modern science could liberate humanity, but only if decentralised and run by federations of workers. Otherwise, the Industrial Revolution meant only bigger prisons with smokestacks. Even the so-called mob responses, Luddites smashing frames, miners striking, dockers walking out, weren't mindless. They were community rules enforced against bosses. Thompson later showed these weren't spasms of chaos but moral economies in action. Anarchists recognised them as embryonic forms of direct action, the strike, the boycott, the sabotage. The Industrial Revolution gave anarchism both its enemy and its hope. The enemy of a wage slavery and hierarchy, the hope of collective power capable of transforming work into freedom. If Proudhon stretched a plan for workers' associations, Bakunin threw a torch into the factory floor. Watching the rise of industry, he argued that the new working class wasn't just a victim, it was the force that could bring the whole edifice of state and capital crashing down. The factory didn't just exploit humans, it drilled obedience into them. And that, for Bakunin, meant revolt was not possible, but inevitable. A fiery Russian exile who spent most of his life in Switzerland, he declared that the state itself was the root of oppression. Even a workers' state, he warned, would only create a new ruling class. Freedom without socialism is privilege and injustice, but socialism without freedom is slavery and brutality. His vision was of federated workers and peasants tearing down both the palace and the factory system that served it, and building new structures of self-rule in their place. In 1871, Paris erupted. After France's defeat in the French-Prussian War, the capital rose against both foreign occupation and its own rulers. Workers, artisans and National Guards took control and declared the Commune. For 2 short months, the city became a living laboratory of bottom-up power. Neighbourhood assemblies debated laws, workers managed workshops, rents were cancelled. Equal pay was introduced for teachers, and women's clubs organised food and defence. Authority was stripped back to the street level. Councillors were elected, recallable and accountable. Louis Michel, the Red Virgin, fought on the barricades and later described the Commune as a glimpse of what freedom might look like. The Commune terrified Europe's elites. For them it was mob rule, red anarchy, a nightmare and order without rulers. For anarchists like Kropotkin and Reclus, it was proof that ordinary people could organise society themselves, not perfectly, not without struggle, but with courage and creativity. Its bloody suppression, tens of thousands massacred in this Samon Saglante, the bloody weekend, became a warning of what the state will do when challenged. The Paris Commune was brief, but it burned into memory. For anarchists before 1900, it stood as both beacon and bloodstain, a lesson that freedom can be built from below, and a reminder of the price demanded by power when it feels its grip slip. Then came Peter Kropotkin, the scientist turned revolutionary. Through his studies of animals and societies, he argued that cooperation and mutual aid was central to evolution as competition. His vision was anarcho-communism, collective ownership, but without a state to run it. He gave anarchism its first systematic and optimistic theory. Women and anarchist feminism. If anarchism was about smashing hierarchy, then the rule of men over women was just another chain to break. From the very start, women were in the thick of the struggle, though history books too often push them to the margins. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication had already shouted in the 1790s that domination is domination, whether in the household or the state. A century later, anarchist women were pushing those ideas into the barricades. Louis Michel fought and organised in the Paris Commune, teaching in schools by day and defending the barricades by night. In her memoirs, she wrote of the Commune as the time when women stepped into their freedom with the same force as men. Flora Tristan in France, decades earlier, linked women's emancipation with women's emancipation. One couldn't happen without the other. Her cry and the emancipation of the working class must be joined with the emancipation of women's, echoed through decades through radical circles. By the late 19th century, anarchist women were building their own networks. In Spain, Teresa Claramunt was called the Spanish Louis Michel, stirring workers with fiery speeches and organising strikes. In Russia, Vera Zasulich turned her anger into action, shooting a police chief in 1878 and later helping to shape socialist and anarchist debates. These women weren't just supporting acts, they were frontline thinkers and fighters. They expanded anarchism when pointing out that freedom from kings and bosses meant nothing if men still ruled the home. By 1900, anarchist feminism was already carving out its place, a reminder that the revolution had to be total, not partial. God and the state. Religion was both ally and enemy for the early anarchists. On one side stood centuries of bishops blessing kings and priests preaching obedience. On the other stood heretics, radicals and visionaries who refused to kneel, showing that faith could just as easily fuel resistance as it could submission. Bakunin didn't mince words. God and the state, he declared. If God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. For him, belief in divine authority was the prototype of all earthly domination. Obeying God trained people to obey masters. Freedom required breaking both chains. His fierce atheism became a cornerstone of much of later anarchist thought. Not all anarchists agreed. Proudhon attached the Catholic Church for its hypocrisy, yet he held it onto a kind of mystical faith in justice and order. He raged at clerical power, but stopped short of pure atheism. For him, religion was less a god to abolish and more hierarchy to strip bare. Then there was Tolstoy. In the late 19th century, the Russian novelist shocked his peers by turning Christianity into an anarchist creed. Reading the Sermon on the Mount literally, he rejected violence, property and the state, insisting that true Christians could only live by love, non-resistance and voluntary cooperation. His pacifist anarchism influenced Gandhi and inspired communities across Europe and America. The tension is clear. Religion could sanctify kings, armies and landlords, but could also arm rebels with moral fire. For anarchists before 1900, the task was to disentangle the two, keeping the spirit of liberation while refusing the authority of priests and gods alike. Other names filled out the chorus. Max Stirner with his radical egoism, the ego in its own, 1844. Joseph Descartes coined libertarian in 1857, and Lise Reclus linking anarchism to geography and ecology. Louise Michel, the Red Virgin of the Paris Commune, stood on barricades and argued for equality for women and men alike. These weren't marginal figures, they were shaping international debates, writing pamphlets, stirring crowds. By the late 19th century, anarchism was an international movement, with newspapers, congresses, and a growing reputation for both theory and action. It was still smeared as chaos by rulers, but for millions it offered a vision of liberation. Violence and propaganda by the deed. By the late 19th century, Anarchism carried two reputations at once, one of hopeful cooperation, the other of dynamite. Newspapers across Europe and America ran headlines about the anarchist menace. Every time a bomb went off or a monarch fell to an assassin's pistol. For many readers, anarchy meant nothing but terror. Some anarchists did turn to violence. After decades of repression, censorship, prison and massacre, patience wore thin. The idea of propaganda by deed spread. Not just words or pamphlets, but spectacular acts that would rattle the powerful and spark rebellion. In 1881, the International Anarchist Congress in London gave the phrase a formal stamp, though even then many delegates argued over what it meant. The deeds followed. In France, Auguste Vaillant threw a bomb into the Chamber of the Deputies in 1893. In Italy, Gaetano Bresci shot King Umberto I in 1900. In Spain, anarchists targeted bishops and officials. In the US, Leon Kosgos assassinated President McKinley in 1901, claiming inspiration from anarchist speeches. Each act fed the headlines, confirming the state's narrative of anarchists as bloodthirsty fanatics. But the reality was more complicated. Most anarchists focused not on bombs but on unions, schools, corporations and newspapers. Prokopkin and Reclus both argued that violence was understandable under tyranny, but education and organisation were the real path to lasting freedom. Emma Goldman, later accused of cheering on violence, insisted that attention to single acts ignored the daily violence of the state itself. Propaganda by the deed was a symptom of frustration, a scream in the dark. It terrified rulers and sold papers, but it never built the new world. The quiet world, federations, collectives, free schools, workers' clubs, carried on in the background, planted seeds that would outlast the explosions. America. Liberty on paper, domination in practice. Across the Atlantic, the American Revolution is often sold as a story of freedom. Colonists threw off the British Crown, drafted the Constitution, declared liberty for all. But dig beneath the fireworks and you see the limits. The Constitution created not a stateless society but a stronger state, centralised, legalistic and protective of property above all. Liberty was enshrined on paper while slavery continued in the fields. The tension is obvious. Revolutionaries cried no taxation without representation, but when farmers and workers tried to resist taxes themselves, like in Shays' Revolution in 1786, the new government crushed them with troops. For anarchists the lesson is clear. Replacing one state with another doesn't remove domination, it just changes uniforms. The Civil War decades later underlined the point. It was war between two states, Union and Confederacy, both claiming legitimacy, both enforcing hierarchy. The cause of emancipation was just, but the means was statist, freedom delivered from above, by armies and decrees. Yet alongside the war, enslaved people liberated themselves. Runaways formed maroon communities in swamps and forests, outside state control, organising survival collectively. Networks like the Underground Railroad formed through voluntary cooperation and secrecy. No leaders, no government, just mutual aid across danger. Those fragments look far more like anarchist than anything written into law. Meanwhile, the expansion of the American state came at brutal cost to indigenous peoples. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 set the tone, and massacres followed. Sand Creek, 1864, Wounded Knee, 1890. Communities with their own systems of self-rule, consensus councils, clan governance, shared land were smashed in the name of civilization. Where indigenous practices often embodied anarchic principles, the state answered with rifles and reservations. By 1900, America was a paradox. It called itself the land of liberty, yet built one of the strongest central states in the world, forged through war, slavery and dispossession. For anarchists, the lesson is sharp. Constitutions and declarations can sing about freedom, but if the state remains, domination survives. The real glimpses of anarchy were not in Philadelphia's parchment halls, but in the self-organisation of rebels, runaways and indigenous nations resisting annihilation. And in the middle of it all, Henry David Thoreau was writing Civil Disobedience. He argued that government is best which governs not at all, a phrase that anarchists later adopted with gusto. Thoreau wasn't calling for barricades, but he planted the seed of refusal. When the state orders injustice, the just response is to step aside and build life without it.